George Strait receives an email. What he discovers changes his life forever. The parking lot of University Hospital was nearly empty at 5:45 in the morning, but Emma Sullivan's beat-up Honda Civic was already there, engine ticking as it cooled in the crisp October air. She sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring at the imposing glass building that had been her second home for the past 3 years, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. Today felt different. Today felt like the day. Her world would finally crumble completely. The automatic doors whooshed open as she approached, her worn nursing shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The familiar scent of antiseptic and coffee hit her nostrils, a smell that had once brought her comfort, but now made her stomach churn with anxiety. She had been dreading this moment for weeks, ever since the whispered conversations in the break. Room had started, since the mysterious closed-door meetings between administrators had become more frequent. "Emma, honey, you're early again," called out Margaret, the night shift supervisor, her voice carrying that particular tone that made Emma's blood run cold. It was the voice people used when they were about to deliver bad news, wrapped in false sweetness like a bitter pill coated in sugar. Emma forced a smile. The same smile she had perfected over the past 3 years since David died in that God-forsaken desert halfway around the world. It was the smile that said everything was fine, that she was holding it together, that she didn't cry herself to sleep every night wondering how she was going to keep her family afloat. "You know me, Margaret. Can't seem to sleep past 5 anyway." The truth was, Emma hadn't slept properly in months. Every night she would lie in the bed she had once shared with David, listening to the old house creak and settle around her, calculating and recalculating numbers that never seemed to add up. The mortgage payment, the utilities, the groceries, Jack's medication, the daycare fees. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces, and she was running out of ways to make it work. Before diving deeper into this heart-wrenching story, I want to ask you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. These stories of hope and resilience need to be shared, and your support helps us bring you more incredible tales like this one. Also, please take a second to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think of Emma's journey so far. Your engagement means the world to us, and we love hearing from our amazing community of viewers. Margaret's expression shifted, and Emma knew immediately that her worst fears were about to be confirmed. "Emma, sweetie, I need you to come with me to Mr. Henderson's office before you start your shift." The walk down the corridor felt like a death march. Emma's mind raced through every possible scenario, but deep down she knew what was coming. The hospital had been struggling financially for months, and the rumors of layoffs had been circulating like a cancer through the staff. She had hoped, prayed even, that her 3 years of perfect attendance, her willingness to work double shifts, her dedication to her patients would be enough to protect her. But hope, she was learning, was a luxury she could no longer afford. Mr. Henderson, the hospital administrator, was a thin man with kind eyes that couldn't quite meet hers as she entered his office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his face as he gestured for her to sit in the worn leather chair across from his desk. "Emma, I'm going to cut straight to the point because I respect you too much to dance around this," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "The board has made some difficult decisions about staffing cuts, and unfortunately, your position is being eliminated, effective immediately." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had prepared herself for this moment, had rehearsed what she would say, how she would react, but nothing could have prepared her for the crushing weight of reality. Her vision blurred momentarily, and she had to grip the arms of the chair to keep from falling forward. "I understand," she managed to whisper, though she understood nothing at all. How could she understand how she was going to tell Jack and Lily that Mommy lost her job? How could she understand how she was going to make next month's mortgage payment? How could she understand how everything she had worked so hard to build was slipping through her fingers like sand? Emma, I want you to know that this decision has nothing to do with your performance. You're one of our best nurses, and if circumstances were different... Henderson's voice trailed off, and Emma realized that his platitudes, however well-intentioned, were nothing more than noise. What mattered now was survival. The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and explanations about COBRA benefits she couldn't afford and unemployment compensation that would barely cover her groceries. She cleaned out her locker mechanically, stuffing her personal items into a cardboard box that seemed to mock her with its smallness. 3 years of her life, 3 years of caring for patients, of working nights and weekends, of sacrificing time with her children, and it all fit into a box no bigger than a shoebox. As she walked to her car, the morning sun was beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. It should have been beautiful, but Emma saw only the approaching storm clouds on the horizon. She sat in her car for a long moment, staring at the hospital building, feeling like she was saying goodbye to more than just a job. She was saying goodbye to security, to the illusion that hard work and dedication were enough to keep your head above water. The drive home took her through the neighborhoods she had driven through thousands of times before, but today they looked different. The neat suburban houses with their manicured lawns and two-car garages seemed to mock her with their stability. She found herself wondering about the people inside those houses, whether they had ever felt the crushing weight of uncertainty that was now pressing down on her chest like a lead blanket. When she pulled into her driveway, she sat for a moment looking at the house she and David had bought with such hope and excitement 6 years ago. It was a modest 2-story colonial with white shutters and a small front porch where they had planned to sit and watch their children play in the yard. The mortgage had seemed manageable then, with both of their incomes and a future that stretched out before them like an open highway. Now, the house felt like a millstone around her neck. The paint was peeling in places, the gutters needed cleaning, and the front steps had a loose board that she kept meaning to fix, but never had the time or money to address. It was still home, but it was a home under siege, threatened by forces beyond her control. She could hear voices coming from the backyard as she approached the house, and her heart lifted slightly despite everything. Mrs. Martinez, her elderly neighbor, was watching Jack and Lily while Emma worked, and the sound of her children's laughter was like a balm to her wounded soul. Jack was pushing Lily on the old tire swing that David had hung from the oak tree, and Lily was shrieking with delight, her blonde curls flying in the morning breeze. "Mommy!" Lily spotted her first and came, running, her small arms wrapping around Emma's legs with the fierce intensity that only a 5-year-old could muster. Jack followed more slowly, his face serious in the way that reminded Emma so much of his father. It sometimes took her breath away. "You're home early, Mama," Jack observed, his dark eyes studying her face with the unsettling perceptiveness that had developed since his father's death. He had become her little protector, always watching, always worrying, carrying burdens that no 5-year-old should have to bear. Emma knelt down to hug both of her children, breathing in the scent of their shampoo and the morning air that clung to their clothes. For a moment, she allowed herself to forget about the disaster that her life had become and simply existed in this perfect bubble of love and innocence. "I got off work early today," she said, which was technically true, though it was a truth that came with a price she wasn't sure she could afford to pay. "How about we make some pancakes for breakfast?" The children cheered and ran toward the house, their problems forgotten in the way that only children could manage. Emma watched them go, their energy and joy a stark contrast to the weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. She thought about the conversation she would have to have with them soon, about the changes that were coming, about the uncertainty that lay ahead. Mrs. Martinez approached slowly, her weathered face creased with concern. She was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she had the kind of presence that commanded respect. She had been Emma's guardian angel since David's death, appearing at just the right moments with a casserole or an offer to watch the children, never asking for anything in return. "Mija, you look like you've seen a ghost," Mrs. Martinez said, her voice gentle but probing. What happened? Emma tried to maintain her composure, but the kindness in the older woman's voice was her undoing. The tears she had been holding back all morning finally came, and she found herself sobbing in her neighbor's arms like a child. "I lost my job," she whispered between sobs. "They laid me off this morning, and I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know how I'm going to keep the house, how I'm going to take care of Jack and Lily. I feel like I'm drowning, and I don't know how to swim anymore." Mrs. Martinez held her tighter, making soothing sounds in Spanish that Emma didn't understand, but that comforted her nonetheless. When the tears finally subsided, the older woman pulled back and looked Emma in the eye with the fierce determination that had carried her through 73 years of life. "Listen to me, Mija. You are stronger than you know. You have been through worse than this and survived. You will survive this too, because you have to. Those babies need you, and you need them. We will figure this out together, one day at a time." Emma nodded, though she couldn't quite bring herself to believe it. The problems ahead seemed too big, too overwhelming, too impossible to solve. But Mrs. Martinez's words planted a small seed of hope in her heart, a seed that would need careful tending if it was going to grow into something that could sustain her through the dark days ahead. As she walked into her house, Emma had no idea that 2,000 miles away, a man she had never met was about to receive a message that would change everything. She had no idea that her neighbor's grandson, who worked as a sound technician in Nashville, had been listening to Mrs. Martinez's stories about the young widow next door. She had no idea that in a few hours her story would reach someone who had the power to help, someone who understood loss and resilience in ways that few people could. All she knew was that she had to keep moving forward, one step at a time, for Jack and Lily, for David's memory, and for the small flame of hope that still flickered in her heart despite everything that threatened to extinguish it. Meanwhile, in a sprawling office building in Nashville, Tennessee, George Strait was settling into his leather chair with a cup of black coffee, preparing for what he thought would be a routine afternoon of reviewing tour schedules and promotional materials. The autumn sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his manager's office, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where contracts and correspondence were neatly organized in precise stacks. George had been in the music business for over 4 decades, and at 69 years old, he had seen it all. The industry had changed dramatically since he first stepped onto a stage in Texas, but his commitment to his craft and his fans had remained unwavering. He was known for his professionalism, his humility, and his genuine care for the people who supported his music, qualities that had earned him the respect of everyone from fellow musicians to venue staff. His manager, Tom Reynolds, was shuffling through papers with the efficiency of a man who had been handling George's career for the better part of 2 decades. "We've got the final details for the Houston show next month," Tom was saying, his voice carrying the familiar cadence of business discussions they had had thousands of times before. "The venue is sold out, and the local media wants to do a few interviews the day before." George nodded absently, his attention divided between Tom's words and the persistent chime of his phone indicating new emails. Most of his correspondence went through Tom or his assistant, but George maintained a personal email account that only a select few people knew about. It was his way of staying connected to the world outside the carefully managed bubble of celebrity life. The subject line of the newest email caught his eye immediately. "You saved my life without knowing it." George frowned, his first instinct being to assume it was spam or another request for money disguised as a personal story. Over the years, he had received thousands of similar messages, each one claiming some life-changing connection to his music, most of them ending with a request for financial assistance or a personal favor. But something about this particular subject line gave him pause. There was a simplicity to it, a directness that cut through the usual flowery language of fan mail. Against his better judgment, George found himself clicking on the message, his curiosity overriding his usual caution. The email was longer than most, but it was the opening line that made George's coffee cup pause halfway to his lips. "Mr. Strait, I don't want anything from you. I just wanted you to know that your music saved my life last Tuesday, and I thought, you should know that sometimes art reaches people in ways the artist never intended." George set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair, his attention now fully captured. The message was from someone named Emma Sullivan, and as he read further, he felt a familiar tightness in his chest that always came when he encountered genuine human suffering. The story unfolded like a country song itself, filled with loss, struggle, and the kind of raw emotion that had drawn him to music in the first place. Emma wrote about her husband David, a soldier who had died in Afghanistan 3 years earlier, leaving her alone with twin 5-year-old children. She described the overwhelming responsibility of single parenthood, the financial pressures, and the constant ache of grief that never quite went away. But what captured George's attention most was how she described the role his music had played in her life. "David and I danced to your song at our wedding," she wrote. "It was the first song we ever danced to, and every time I hear it, I can still feel his arms around me. After he died, I couldn't listen to it anymore. It hurt too much. But last Tuesday, driving home from the hospital after losing my job, it came on the radio. And instead of changing the station like I always do, I pulled over and listened to every word." George found himself reading more slowly, absorbing each word with the care he usually reserved for studying lyrics. Emma's writing was simple but powerful, devoid of the manipulation he had come to expect from strangers reaching out to him. She wasn't asking for anything, wasn't trying to sell him on her worthiness or her children's cuteness. She was simply sharing a moment of connection, an instance where music had served its highest purpose. "I was sitting in my car, crying and wondering how I was going to keep my family together," the email continued. "The twins were at daycare, and I had exactly 47 minutes before I had to pick them up and pretend that everything was okay. That's when your voice came through the radio, and I remembered something David used to say about your music. He said you sang like you understood what it meant to work hard and love deeply and sometimes lose everything that mattered." George felt his throat tighten as he continued reading. Emma described how she had sat in her car listening to the song, remembering her wedding day, remembering the dreams she and David had shared, and somehow finding the strength to drive home and face her children with hope instead of despair. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," the email concluded. "I guess I just wanted you to know that your music isn't just entertainment. It's a lifeline for people like me, people who are trying to hold on when everything seems to be falling apart. Thank you for giving me the strength to go home and hug my children and believe that tomorrow might be better than today." The message was signed simply Emma Sullivan, San Antonio, Texas, with no phone number, no address, no request for a response. It was the kind of correspondence that George treasured most, the kind that reminded him why he had chosen music as his life's work. Tom had stopped talking and was looking at George with concern. "Everything okay, George? You look like you've seen a ghost." George looked up from his phone, his mind still processing what he had just read. "Tom, do you remember that show we did in San Antonio back in 2007, the one at the Alamodome?" Tom's brow furrowed as he accessed his mental database. Of thousands of shows, 2007. That was the fall tour, right? I remember that show. Great crowd, sold out. Why? George was quiet for a moment, his mind traveling back to that night. He had performed thousands of shows over the years, but certain moments stood out with crystal clarity. He remembered the young couple in the front row, both of them in military dress uniforms, holding hands and looking at each other with the kind of love that made everyone around them smile. He had dedicated a song to them, something he rarely did for audience members he didn't know. There was a young couple in the front row, George said slowly. Military. They looked so happy, so in love. I dedicated a song to them. Tom nodded, though George could see he didn't quite understand the significance. You've dedicated songs to a lot of people over the years, George. What's this about? George held up his phone, though he didn't show Tom the email. I just got a message from a woman in San Antonio. Her husband was killed in Afghanistan 3 years ago, and she's struggling to raise their twin children alone. She just lost her job, and she was sitting in her car wondering how she was going to keep her family together when one of my songs came on the radio. The office fell silent, except for the distant hum of traffic on Music Row. Tom had worked with George long enough to recognize the signs when something had affected him deeply. George's face had taken on the expression it wore when he was processing something significant, when he was working through a problem that mattered to him personally. George, you get dozens of these kinds of messages every week, Tom said gently. I know they touch you, but you can't carry the weight of everyone's problems. You've got to protect yourself, you know that. George nodded, understanding Tom's concern. His manager had seen him struggle with the balance between caring for his fans and maintaining his own emotional well-being, but this felt different somehow. This felt like more than a random fan letter. I know, George said quietly, but there's something about this one, Tom, something that feels connected. I can't explain it, but I keep thinking about that couple from the San Antonio show. What if it was them? What if I dedicated that song to a young soldier who never made it home? Tom's expression softened. He had been with George through the loss of his daughter Jennifer, had seen how deeply personal tragedy could affect someone who spent his life bringing joy to others. What are you thinking, George? George was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Nashville skyline. I'm thinking maybe I need to know more about this Emma Sullivan. I'm thinking maybe this isn't just a coincidence. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting different shadows across the office, and George felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. He had always believed that music was about more than entertainment, that it was about connection and healing and hope. But he had also learned to be careful about getting too involved in the personal lives of his fans, to protect both himself and them from the complications that celebrity could bring. Still, something about Emma Sullivan's message had reached him in a way that few things had in recent years. Maybe it was the authenticity of her pain, or the way she had asked for nothing while giving him something precious in return. Maybe it was the memory of that young couple from San Antonio, or the reminder of his own losses and the role music had played in his healing. Whatever it was, George found himself making a decision that would change not just his own life, but the lives of a struggling family in Texas who had no idea that their story was about to intersect with one of country music's biggest stars in ways they could never have imagined. The next morning, George was on the phone with Marcus Webb, a private investigator he had used before for sensitive matters. Marcus was a former police detective who had transitioned into private work, specializing in cases that required discretion and absolute confidentiality. He had helped George with various issues over the years, from background checks on potential business partners to handling delicate family matters that needed to stay out of the public eye. I need you to look into someone for me, George said, his voice carrying the weight of a sleepless night spent thinking about Emma Sullivan's message. But Marcus, This has to be handled with kid gloves. I don't want this woman to know she's being investigated, and I need to know that anything you find stays between us." Marcus's gravelly voice came through the phone with the professionalism George had come to rely on. "You know I don't ask questions about motivation, George, but I need to know what level of investigation you're looking for. Are we talking basics, background check, or do you need me to dig deeper?" George hesitated, still uncertain about how far he was willing to go. "I need to know if her story is true. I need to know about her financial situation, her family, her husband's military service. I need to know if she's legitimate or if this is some kind of elaborate scam." "I understand," Marcus replied. "Give me what you have, and I'll start with the basics: military records, employment history, public records. If she's legitimate, it'll show. If she's not, that'll show too." George provided Emma's name and location, along with the details from her email about her husband's death and her recent job loss. As he spoke, he found himself hoping that Marcus would find evidence of deception, that this would turn out to be just another attempt to manipulate his emotions for financial gain. It would be easier that way, cleaner, with no obligation to act. But even as he hoped for that outcome, George knew in his heart that Emma Sullivan's pain was real. There had been something in her words, a rawness that couldn't be fabricated, that spoke to the deepest parts of his own experience with loss and grief. 3 days later, Marcus called back with a preliminary report that made George's chest tighten with a mixture of vindication and sorrow. "She's real, George. Everything she told you checks out, and then some. Her husband, David Michael Sullivan, was killed by an IED in Afghanistan in October of 2021. He was a staff sergeant, served 2 tours, left behind a wife and twin children." George closed his eyes, feeling the weight of confirmation settle over him. What about her job situation? She was laid off from University Hospital 5 days ago due to budget cuts. She's been working there for 3 years, excellent performance reviews, picked up extra shifts whenever possible. Her supervisor told me off the record that letting her go was one of the hardest things he'd ever had to do. The information came in a steady stream, each detail adding to the picture of a woman who was drowning despite her best efforts to stay afloat. Marcus had discovered that Emma was behind on her mortgage payments, that one of her children required expensive medication for asthma, and that she had been selling personal belongings to make ends meet. "There's something else, George," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a different tone. "I've found something that I think you need to see in person. Can you meet me at my office this afternoon?" George agreed, spending the rest of the morning in a state of nervous anticipation. What could Marcus have discovered that required an in-person meeting? As he drove to Marcus's office in downtown Nashville, George found himself thinking about the randomness of human connection, about how lives could intersect in ways that seemed impossible to predict. Marcus's office was a small, cluttered space above a deli on 2nd Avenue. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and filing cabinets that spoke to decades of investigative work. Marcus himself was a bear of a man, with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen more than their share of human suffering. "George, you need to see these," Marcus said without preamble, sliding a manila envelope across his desk. "I had a contact in San Antonio take some photographs of the family's home just to verify the living situation. What I found is going to knock you on your ass." George opened the envelope with trembling fingers, not sure what to expect. The first few photographs showed a modest 2-story house with a small front yard, exactly the kind of middle-class home that thousands of military families called home across America. But it was the 4th photograph that made George's breath catch in his throat. The image showed the interior of the Sullivan family's living room, taken through a front window. The furniture was simple but well-maintained, clearly chosen with care and love. Children's toys were scattered across the floor and family photographs lined the mantelpiece. But dominating one wall was a large framed poster that made George's heart race. It was a concert poster from his show in San Antonio on October 15th, 2007. The poster was professionally framed and prominently displayed, clearly a treasured possession. But what made George's hands shake was the autograph visible in the corner of the poster, an inscription he had written to a young military couple who had caught his attention that night. "To David and Emma," the inscription read in George's own handwriting. "Thanks for your service and your love. May you dance to this song for 50 years. George Strait." The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. George remembered the young couple now, remembered how they had looked at each other during the slow songs, remembered the joy on their faces when he had called them forward after the show to sign their poster. He remembered thinking at the time that they were the kind of couple who gave him hope for the future, who reminded him why songs about love and commitment mattered. "Jesus Christ," George whispered, staring at the photograph. "It's them. It's actually them." Marcus nodded grimly. "I figured you'd recognize it. There's more, George. I did some digging into the timeline. David Sullivan was deployed to Afghanistan in March of 2021. He was killed 7 months later. Emma has been raising those twins alone ever since, and from what I can tell, she's been doing it with grace and dignity, despite circumstances that would break most people." George set the photographs down on Marcus's desk, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had discovered. This wasn't just a random fan reaching out to him with a sad story. This was a woman whose life had intersected with his in a moment of joy and celebration, who had treasured that memory even as her world fell apart around her. "There's something else," Marcus continued, pulling out another photograph. "This one really got to me. It's a picture of the twins' bedroom." The image showed a small room with bunk beds and walls covered in children's artwork. But what caught George's attention was a small framed photograph on the nightstand between the beds. It showed David Sullivan in his military uniform, standing next to Emma in her wedding dress, both of them beaming with happiness. Next to the photograph was a small CD player, and George could just make out the edge of one of his albums. "Their neighbor told my contact that Emma plays your music for the kids every night," Marcus said quietly. "She tells them stories about their father, and she plays the songs that she and David used to dance to. She's keeping his memory alive through your music, George." The weight of responsibility settled on George's shoulders like a heavy blanket. This was no longer about a random act of kindness or a simple charitable gesture. This was about honoring a connection that had been forged years ago, about completing a circle that had been broken by war and loss. "What's her current situation?" George asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus consulted his notes, his expression growing more grave. "It's not good, George. She's got maybe 6 weeks before the bank forecloses on the house. She's been applying for jobs, but the market is tight, and she's either overqualified or underqualified for most positions. She's got about $300 in her checking account, and Jack's medical bills are piling up." George felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same anger he had felt when he lost his daughter Jennifer, when he had been forced to confront the randomness and cruelty of life. But this time, unlike then, he had the power to do something about it. "I want to help her," George said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "But I need to do it right. I don't want to embarrass her or make her feel like charity case. This needs to be done with dignity, in a way that honors her husband's memory and protects her children." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying. George with the calculating look of a man who had spent years reading people. "That's going to be tricky, George. How do you help someone without them knowing you're helping them? George was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photographs spread across Marcus's desk. The image of the concert poster kept drawing his attention, reminding him of that night in San Antonio when he had looked out at a crowd of faces and seen something special in a young couple who had no idea their lives would intersect with his again under such different circumstances. "I need to think about this," George said finally. "But Marcus, I want you to keep watching her situation. If things get worse, if she's about to lose the house, or if one of the kids needs medical care she can't afford, I need to know immediately." Marcus nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. What if she recognizes you when you make your move? What if she realizes that you're the one helping her? George stood up, gathering the photographs and tucking them back into the envelope. "Then I guess I'll have to be honest with her. I'll have to tell her that sometimes the universe works in mysterious ways and that some connections are too important to ignore." As George left Marcus's office, his mind was already working through the possibilities. He had helped people before, had quietly paid medical bills and mortgage payments for fans who were struggling, but this felt different, more personal, more meaningful. This was about honoring a promise he had made to a young couple in love, about making sure that David Sullivan's children grew up knowing that their father's sacrifice had not been forgotten. The drive back to his own home took him through the heart of Nashville, past the honky-tonks and record labels that had shaped his career. But George's mind was 2 states away, focused on a modest house in San Antonio where a young widow was tucking her children into bed, playing his music and telling them stories about the father they would never really know. He had 48 hours to come up with a plan, 48 hours to figure out how to help Emma Sullivan without destroying the dignity and independence that had carried her through 3 years of unimaginable hardship. The challenge energized him in a way that nothing had in years, reminding him that sometimes the most important work happened not on stage in front of thousands of fans, but in the quiet moments when one person reached out to help another. George spent the next 2 days in a state of focused determination that his team hadn't seen in years. He made phone calls to contacts he hadn't spoken to in months, researched organizations and programs that might provide a legitimate cover for his assistance, and worked with Tom to create what they privately called Operation Second Chance. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. George would establish a scholarship fund for healthcare workers who had lost their jobs due to budget cuts, specifically targeting single parents with military connections. The fund would be administered through a respected non-profit organization in Texas, with Emma Sullivan being the first recipient. To make it appear legitimate, George would fund several other recipients as well, creating a genuine program that could help multiple families while ensuring Emma's situation didn't stand out. But even as he put the pieces in place, George knew that the hardest part would be ensuring Emma actually applied for and accepted the help. Marcus had reported that she was proud to a fault, the kind of person who would rather go hungry than ask for charity. The application process would need to seem natural, like an opportunity that had come her way through legitimate channels. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Henley, the chief of staff at University Hospital where Emma had worked, was a longtime friend of George's family. When George reached out to her, explaining the general situation without revealing Emma's identity, Dr. Henley was immediately interested in participating. "We've had to let go of some of our best people," Dr. Henley confided during their phone conversation. "It's heartbreaking, especially when you know these are good people who are struggling through no fault of their own. If you can create a program that helps them transition to new opportunities, I'd be happy to recommend qualified candidates." The pieces fell into place over the next week. The scholarship fund was established with the University of Texas Health Science Center, offering full tuition and a living stipend for experienced nurses who wanted to pursue advanced certifications. In pediatric care, the program would place graduates in high-paying positions at children's hospitals throughout Texas, with guaranteed employment upon completion. Emma received the letter on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after losing her job. She'd been preparing for another day of fruitless job hunting when Mrs. Martinez knocked on her door, holding an official-looking envelope that had been delivered to the wrong address. "This is for you, mija," Mrs. Martinez said, handing over. "The envelope, with the University of Texas seal, looks important." Emma opened the letter with trembling hands, expecting another bill or another rejection. Instead, she found herself reading about an opportunity that seemed too good to be true. The Henderson Strait Healthcare Scholarship Program was offering full funding for advanced nursing certification, along with a generous living stipend and guaranteed job placement upon graduation. "Based on your exemplary service record and current circumstances," the letter read, "you have been selected as a potential recipient of this scholarship. The program is specifically designed to assist healthcare workers who have been affected by recent budget cuts in Texas hospitals." Emma read the letter 3 times, each time expecting to find the catch, the fine print that would reveal this was some kind of scam. But the letterhead was legitimate, the contact information checked out, and when she called the number provided, she was connected to Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the program coordinator, who spoke knowledgeably about Emma's background and qualifications. "We've been reviewing applications from healthcare workers across Texas," Dr. Martinez explained. "Your former supervisor, Dr. Henley, provided a glowing recommendation. She spoke very highly of your skills and your dedication to your patients." Emma felt a surge of gratitude toward Dr. Henley, who had been one of the few bright spots during her final days at University Hospital. "I don't understand how I qualified for this," Emma said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I never applied for any scholarship programs." "The program is designed to identify qualified candidates through our network of healthcare professionals," Dr. Martinez explained smoothly. "We believe in reaching out to people who might not otherwise know about these opportunities. Are you interested in learning more?" Emma's mind raced through the possibilities. The program would require her to relocate to Austin for 18 months of intensive training, but it would provide housing assistance and childcare support. Most importantly, it would lead to a position at Children's Hospital of Austin with a salary that would be nearly double what she had been earning at University Hospital. "I have 2 young children," Emma said, her practical nature warring with her desperate hope. "I don't know if I can manage the logistics of moving and studying while caring for them." "That's exactly why we include comprehensive support services," Dr. Martinez assured her. "We understand that many of our recipients are single parents or have other challenging circumstances. The program is designed to help you succeed, not to add more stress to your life." Over the next hour, Dr. Martinez walked Emma through every aspect of the program, addressing her concerns and painting a picture of a future that seemed almost too bright to believe. By the end of the conversation, Emma found herself saying yes to an opportunity that would change her life and the lives of her children. What Emma didn't know was that George Strait was sitting in his Nashville office, listening to updates from Marcus Webb, who had been monitoring the situation from a distance. The plan was working better than anyone had dared to hope, but George knew that the real test would come when Emma actually began the program and realized how thoroughly her life was being supported. 2 weeks later, Emma was packing her modest belongings into a rental truck, preparing to move to Austin with Jack and Lily. The program had provided her with a furnished apartment near the university, complete with a playground for the children and a highly recommended daycare center just blocks away. Mrs. Martinez had cried when Emma told her about the opportunity, recognizing it as the miracle they had both been praying for. "God works in mysterious ways, mija," the older woman had said, hugging Emma tightly. "Sometimes angels come disguised as bureaucrats with scholarships." As Emma loaded the last of her boxes into the truck, she found herself thinking about the chain of events that had led her to this moment. Losing her job had felt like the end of the world, but it had somehow opened a door to possibilities she had never imagined. She thought about David, about how proud he would be to see her pursuing her dreams while caring for their children. The drive to Austin took 4 hours, with Jack and Lily chattering excitedly in the back seat about their new adventure. Emma had shown them pictures of their new apartment, of the playground where they would play, of the school where they would eventually enroll. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel genuine optimism about the future. But even as Emma began to rebuild her life in Austin, George Strait was dealing with complications he hadn't anticipated. Marcus Webb had discovered that Emma's mortgage company was refusing to work with her despite her improved circumstances. The bank had already initiated foreclosure proceedings, and the manager, a man named Richard Thornton, was insisting that the process couldn't be stopped. "He's being a real hard-ass about it," Marcus reported during one of their regular check-ins. "Says that once the foreclosure process starts, it can't be reversed, regardless of changed circumstances. He's technically within his rights, but he's not showing any flexibility." George felt his anger rising as he thought about Emma's house, the home she had shared with David, being sold out from under her while she was trying to build a better life for her children. What kind of man refuses to work with a military widow who's trying to get back on her feet? "The kind who's more concerned with procedures than people," Marcus replied grimly. "I've done some digging on Thornton. He's got a reputation for being inflexible even when it doesn't make business sense. He's the kind of guy who follows the letter of the law without any regard for the spirit." George made a decision that would take him further out of the shadows than he had intended. "Set up a meeting with him. I want to talk to this Thornton personally." Marcus looked surprised. "George, that's going to blow your cover. Once you walk into that bank and identify yourself, there's no going back to anonymous help." George nodded, understanding the implications. Maybe it's time to stop hiding. Maybe some situations require a more direct approach. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday afternoon at First National Bank of San Antonio. George dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a simple suit that conveyed authority without ostentation. He had spent the morning preparing his approach, deciding that honesty and directness would be more effective than any elaborate deception. Richard Thornton was exactly what George had expected. A thin, nervous man in his 50s who seemed uncomfortable with his own authority. His office was sterile and impersonal, dominated by a large desk covered with neat stacks of paperwork and a computer screen that reflected the fluorescent lights overhead. "Mr. Strait, this is certainly unexpected," Thornton said, clearly flustered by having a celebrity in his office. "I'm not sure what I can do for you today." George settled into the chair across from Thornton's desk, his presence filling the small office with quiet authority. "I'm here to talk about Emma Sullivan and the foreclosure proceedings on her property." Thornton's expression shifted from nervousness to confusion. "I'm not sure I understand your interest in this matter, Mr. Strait. Mrs. Sullivan is behind on her mortgage payments, and we've followed all proper procedures. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do to help her at this point." George leaned forward, his voice taking on the steel that had carried him through decades in the music business. "Mr. Thornton, I want you to understand something. Emma Sullivan is not just another name on your foreclosure list. She's a military widow who lost her husband serving our country. She's a mother who's been working 2 jobs to try to keep her family together, and she's a person who deserves better than the treatment she's receiving from this bank. Thornton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unused to being challenged on his decisions. Mr. Strait, I appreciate your concern, but I have policies to follow. Mrs. Sullivan has been delinquent on her payments for 4 months. We've given her multiple opportunities to bring her account current. And now she has a new job and the ability to make those payments, George replied firmly. She's enrolled in a program that will guarantee her employment at a much higher salary. All she needs is a little flexibility from this bank. Thornton's jaw tightened, and George could see the man's stubborn streak emerging. The foreclosure process has already begun, Mr. Strait. Even if Mrs. Sullivan's circumstances have changed, I can't simply reverse procedures that are already in motion. George stood up, his full height making him tower over the seated bank manager. Mr. Thornton, I'm going to be very clear with you. Emma Sullivan is going to keep her house. The only question is whether this bank is going to work with her cooperatively, or whether I'm going to have to make some phone calls to people who can make your life very difficult. The threat hung in the air between them, and George could see Thornton calculating the potential consequences of defying someone with George Strait's influence and connections. After a long moment, the bank manager's shoulders sagged in defeat. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Strait? George smiled, recognizing victory when he saw it. I'm proposing that you restructure Mrs. Sullivan's loan to reflect her new financial circumstances. I'm proposing that you work with her the way you would work with any other customer who's experienced temporary hardship, but is now in a position to meet their obligations. The negotiation took another hour, but by the time George left the bank, Emma Sullivan's house was safe. The foreclosure proceedings had been halted, her loan had been restructured with more favorable terms, and she would be able to keep the home she had shared with David. As George drove back to Nashville, he reflected on how far he had come from his original plan of anonymous assistance. Emma still didn't know about his involvement, but that was about to change. He had one more surprise planned for her, one final gesture that would reveal his identity and complete the circle that had begun with a concert poster signed for a young couple in love. 3 months into Emma's program in Austin, she was thriving in ways she had never imagined possible. The intensive coursework was challenging, but for the first time in years, she felt intellectually stimulated and professionally fulfilled. Jack and Lily had adapted to their new life with the resilience of childhood, making friends at daycare and embracing the adventure of living in a new city. But it was during a quiet evening study session that Emma received a phone call that would change everything once again. Dr. Martinez's voice on the other end carried an excitement that immediately captured Emma's attention. "Emma, I have some incredible news," Dr. Martinez said, barely able to contain her enthusiasm. "We've been selected to participate in a very special event. George Strait is doing a benefit concert for military families in Austin next month, and he specifically requested that our scholarship recipients be honored guests." Emma's heart skipped a beat at the mention of George Strait's name. Even after all these months, his music still held a special place in her heart, still connected her to David in ways that nothing else could. "That's amazing," she managed to say, though her voice was barely a whisper. "The concert is being held at the Frank Irwin Center, and you and the children will have front row seats. There's also a meet and greet afterward, where you'll have the opportunity to personally thank Mr. Strait for his support of the program." Emma's mind reeled at the impossibility of it all. She had grown up listening to George Strait's music, had danced to his songs at her wedding, had found comfort in his voice during her darkest moments. The idea of meeting him in person seemed like something out of a dream. "Dr. Martinez, I don't know what to say. This is so much more than I ever expected when I joined the program. You deserve this, Emma. You've worked incredibly hard, and your dedication to your studies and your children is an inspiration to everyone who knows you. This is just a small way of recognizing everything you've accomplished. After hanging up the phone, Emma sat in her small apartment living room, staring at the framed photograph of David that she kept on the side table. She could almost hear his voice, could almost feel his excitement about the opportunity to meet the singer whose music had been the soundtrack to their love story. "Can you believe this, David?" she whispered to the photograph. "George Strait wants to meet us. The man whose music got me through the worst day of my life wants to shake my hand." The weeks leading up to the concert passed in a blur of anticipation and preparation. Emma bought new outfits for herself and the children, practiced what she would say if she had the chance to speak to George Strait, and tried to manage her expectations about what the evening would actually bring. Jack and Lily, now 6 years old, were excited about the prospect of seeing a real cowboy singer, as they called him. Emma had been playing George's music for them since they were babies, and they knew all the words to "I Cross My Heart," the song that had become their family's anthem. The night of the concert arrived with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy that Emma hadn't felt since her wedding day. She dressed carefully in a simple blue dress that David had always loved, and she wore the small diamond necklace he had given her on their first anniversary. Jack and Lily looked adorable in their matching Western shirts and boots, their faces glowing with anticipation. The Frank Irwin Center was packed with military families, veterans, and country music fans who had come to support the cause. Emma's front row seats provided a perfect view of the stage, and she found herself holding her breath as the lights dimmed and the opening act began. But it was when George Strait himself walked onto the stage that Emma felt the full emotional impact of the moment. There he was, the man whose voice had carried her through 3 years of grief and struggle, whose music had been her constant companion through the darkest nights of her life. George opened with "Amarillo Morning," and Emma felt tears streaming down her face before he had finished the first verse. Jack and Lily were mesmerized by the performance, clapping and singing along with the familiar songs that had become the soundtrack of their childhood. Halfway through the concert, George paused to address the audience directly. "Tonight is about more than just music," he said, his voice carrying across the packed arena. "It's about honoring the families who have sacrificed so much for our freedom, and it's about recognizing the strength and resilience of those who carry on when life gets difficult." Emma's heart pounded as George continued speaking, his words seeming to reach directly into her soul. "I want to tell you about a letter I received a few months ago. It was from a young mother who had lost her husband in Afghanistan, a woman who was struggling to raise her children alone while dealing with challenges that would have broken most people." The arena fell silent as George's voice grew more emotional. "This woman wrote to me not asking for anything, not seeking help or attention, but simply to tell me that music had given her the strength to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. She reminded me why I do what I do, why music matters, why connection between people is the most important thing in the world." Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized George was talking about her email, the message she had sent during her darkest moment. She looked around the arena, wondering if anyone else had made the connection, if anyone else understood that this incredibly public moment was somehow about her private struggle. "That letter changed my life," George continued, his eyes scanning the crowd. "It reminded me that sometimes the most important work we do happens not on stage, but in the quiet moments when we reach out to help each other. It reminded me that music is a bridge between hearts, a way of connecting across distance and difference and loss." As George began to sing "I Cross My Heart," Emma felt the entire arena fade away around her. This was her song, David's song, the song that had brought them together, and the song that had saved her life on that terrible day when she had lost her job and her hope. But as George reached the chorus, something extraordinary happened. He looked directly at Emma, his eyes meeting hers across the crowded arena, and she saw recognition in his gaze. Somehow, impossibly, he knew who she was. "I cross my heart and promise to," George sang, his voice carrying the weight of personal meaning, "give all I've got to give to make all your dreams come true." The song ended to thunderous applause, but Emma barely heard it. She was lost in the impossibility of the moment, in the realization that somehow, in some way she couldn't understand, George Strait had known she was there. After the concert, Emma and the children were escorted backstage by security personnel who treated them with unusual deference. The backstage area was bustling with activity, but Emma felt like she was moving through a dream, still processing the emotional intensity of what had just happened. When they were finally led into George's private dressing room, Emma's knees nearly buckled with nervousness. George was sitting on a couch, still wearing his concert clothes, but his demeanor was completely different from his stage persona. He looked tired but peaceful, like a man who had just completed something important. "Emma Sullivan," he said, standing up as she entered the room, "I've been looking forward to meeting you for a very long time." Emma's voice caught in her throat as she tried to respond. "Mr. Strait, I don't understand. How did you know I was here?" George smiled, the same warm smile that had charmed audiences for decades. "Because I've been watching over you and your family for months now. Because that email you sent me changed my life, and I wanted to make sure your life changed too." The truth came out slowly, gently, with George explaining about the scholarship program he had created, about the intervention with the bank, about the months of careful planning that had led to this moment. Emma listened in stunned silence, holding Jack and Lily close to her sides, trying to process the magnitude of what George was telling her. "But why?" she finally managed to ask. "Why would you do all this for someone you've never met?" George walked over to his desk and picked up a framed photograph that Emma immediately recognized. It was a picture from his concert in San Antonio in 2007, showing George with a young couple in military dress uniforms. Emma gasped as she realized she was looking at herself and David, captured in a moment of pure joy and love. "Because I did meet you," George said softly. "I met you and David that night in San Antonio. I signed your poster. I dedicated a song to you. And I remember thinking that you were the kind of couple who gave me hope for the future." Emma's tears came freely now, and she found herself laughing and crying at the same time. "You remember us. After all these years, after all the thousands of people you've met, you remember us? Some moments stay with you forever," George replied, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "And when I read your email, when I realized who you were, I knew. I had to help. I knew David would have wanted me to take care of his family." The conversation continued for another hour, with George sharing stories about his own experiences with loss and grief, about the role music had played in his healing, about the importance of connection and community in overcoming life's challenges. Jack and Lily, initially shy, gradually warmed up to the famous singer, charmed by his gentle manner and genuine interest in their lives. As the evening wound down, George made Emma a promise that would change her life yet again. "I want you to know that this doesn't end here," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine commitment. "I want to be part of your family's life, to watch Jack and Lily grow up, to be there for you the way David would have wanted." Emma nodded, overwhelmed by the generosity and kindness of this man who had already given her so much. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "I don't know how to repay everything you've done." George smiled and shook his head. "You don't repay kindness, Emma. You pass it on. You live your life with the same courage and dignity you've shown for the past 3 years. You raise those beautiful children to be the kind of people their father would be proud of. That's all the thanks I need." As Emma and the children prepared to leave, George handed her a small wrapped package. "This is something I wanted David to have," he said quietly. "Something to remember that love doesn't end with death. It just changes form." Emma unwrapped the package with trembling hands, revealing a beautiful silver music box. When she opened it, the familiar melody of "I Cross My Heart" began to play, and she saw that the inside of the box was engraved with a message. "For David and Emma Sullivan, may your love story continue forever." Gage to Strait. 6 months later, Emma graduated from her program with honors and began her new position as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital of Austin. Her salary was more than she had ever imagined, and for the first time since David's death, she felt truly secure about her family's future. But more than the financial security, Emma treasured the ongoing friendship with George Strait that had developed over the months following their first meeting. He had become a mentor to Jack and Lily, a source of wisdom and support that helped fill the void left by their father's absence. On the 3rd anniversary of David's death, Emma received a package from George containing a special gift, a recording of himself singing "I Cross My Heart" directly to David's memory, along with a letter explaining how David's sacrifice had inspired the scholarship program that was now helping dozens of military families across Texas. "Your husband's legacy lives on," George had written, "not just in the beautiful children he left behind, but in the lives of every family we've been able to help through this program. His love for you and Jack and Lily has rippled outward, touching people he never met in ways he never could have imagined." Emma placed the recording next to David's photograph on her nightstand, where it joined the music box George had given her that magical night in Austin. Every evening, she would play one or the other for Jack and Lily, telling them stories about their father and about the extraordinary man who had helped their family when they needed it most. The children, now 7 years old, had grown to think of George as a beloved uncle, someone who sent birthday cards and Christmas presents, who called to check on their school progress, who had promised to teach them to ride horses when they were old enough to visit his ranch. As Emma tucked her children into bed each night, she would look at the framed poster from the 2007 concert that still hung on their wall, now accompanied by a new photograph, one of George, with Jack and Lily at the Austin concert, all three of them laughing at something Jack had said. The poster's inscription had taken on new meaning over the years. "Thanks for your service and your love. May you dance to this song for 50 years. Emma realized now that George's words had been prophetic. She and David had danced to that song for only 5 years before he was taken from her. But their love story was continuing in ways neither of them could have imagined. Through George's kindness, through the connections forged by music and memory, through the simple act of one person reaching out to help another, Emma had learned that some promises transcend death, that some bonds are stronger than loss, and that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives are written by the kindness of strangers who become family. The story that had begun with a desperate email sent in a moment of crushing despair had become something far more beautiful, a testament to the power of music to heal, the importance of community in times of struggle, and the way love can multiply when it's shared with generous hearts. Emma Sullivan's life had been saved not just by George Strait's music, but by his willingness to transform that music into action, to turn inspiration into intervention, to prove that sometimes the most important work we do happens not on stage or in the spotlight, but in the quiet moments when we choose to care for one another. And in a modest house in Austin, Texas, 2 children would grow up knowing that their father's love had reached across death itself to ensure their future, carried by the voice of a country singer who understood that the most powerful songs are the ones we live, not just the ones we sing.